Well, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, title of my address is Slovenia 25, a story of nation building. And I'll try to tell you in 15 minutes. But first, I would like to say that I'm really happy to be here in Philadelphia, cradle of American nation, cradle of the highest, I would say, finest democratic traditions. It's hard to find another place to talk about nation building than Philadelphia. I must say that I was attracted by the title of this year's Sovereign Challenge conference, namely Identity, Institutions, and Independence, the Evolution of Nations. It fits perfectly the story that I want to share with you, the story of evolution of my country or of the Slovenian nation. I will start by setting out why I believe the case of our nation is special, and will point out some lessons that could be drawn from our story. I will then try and guide you through the Slovenian nation building and the challenges to its sovereignty of the past and, of course, present. Each nation, of course, has its own story to tell. Every single one is interesting for its own set of reasons. I will try to sum up the main features of the Slovenian case that I think are particularly inspirational. First, the location. Slovenia is situated in the center of the European continent, in the part of Europe where the history was rarely dull. The territory of modern Slovenia has been a theater of many historical dramas. Borders have changed back and forth. Rulers have come and gone. Slovenians, however, have stayed for about 1500 years. Second, the size. History has not always been very kind to small nations in this perspective. It is indeed remarkable that a nation of 2 million on the territory of the size of New Jersey has not only survived but has thrived as a community and matured into a modern sovereign nation. Third, the strength of cultural identity. With less than favorable external circumstances, Slovenians had to rely on their internal strengths. What preserved us as a nation was internal cohesion of a group of people who feel a sense of community, common origin, and shared future. This cohesion was founded upon our culture, in particular on our language. Fourth, peaceful path to independence. Birth of nation state has often been a violent affair, in particular when it follows a collapse of our multinational state. Slovenia too, unfortunately, has paid its toll in human lives. However, with the benefit of the hindsight, the path from self-determination towards independence and sovereignty has been relatively peaceful. It was guided by the fundamental principles of international law, such as self-determination and peaceful coexistence. 5, Euro-Atlantic integration. It might seem paradoxical at the first sight that Slovenians, after gaining independence in 1991, rushed to join the European Union and NATO in 2004, effectively giving up voluntarily a portion of the newly gained sovereignty. However, for Slovenians, acceding to both Euro-Atlantic integrations was an integral part of our fight for independence. The sense of belonging to both the European Union and the NATO was overwhelming. Colleagues, allow me now to run you through the story of our nation building. Our ancestors settled this part of Europe in the 6th century. As soon as in the 7th century, the first proto-state that embraced the Slovenian tribes was founded in the area. The Principality of Carantania endured for almost 300 years. It was notable for the ritual of installing the leader at the Prince's Stone. Representative of the people has symbolically relinquished the seat as a symbol of power to the chosen leader. It would be a stretch to call the procedure democratic in the modern meaning of the term. However, the fundamental idea that power emanates from people was there. I am mentioning this ritual because since it is believed to have a link to US history. The installation of the ruler of Carantania was namely described by the French historian Jean Bodin in his book Les 6 Livres de la République. Thomas Jefferson underlined a reference to the ritual in his copy of the book, which gave rise to speculation that it was one of the sources of inspiration when he was drafting the Declaration of Independence. As for Slovenians, it took more than a millennium to live in our old state again. After the demise of Carantania, foreign rulers, mostly German-speaking, have governed the territories inhabited by Slovenians. First the Habsburg monarchy and then Austro-Hungarian Empire up until 1918. Through this period, it was predominantly the Slovenian language that sustained the strong sense of identity and Slovenians as a political community. The earliest writings in Slovenian language date back to the year 1000, and the first book in Slovenia was printed in 1550. It would be wrong, though, to assume that our culture autonomy was always encouraged or even allowed under foreign rule. Our nation remembers both the periods of repression and attempts to erase the identity of our people and to obliterate our language, as well as the periods when it was easier to be Slovenian. Introduction of the compulsory primary schooling in the 18th century under Austria, for example, was instrumental for the survival of our nation. Through the bad and good times, the language and the culture showed incredible persistence and allowed the sense of Slovenians as a distinct entity to grow. On this foundation, Slovenians were also gradually building a political conscience. The most tangible sign of how the Slovenian nation was awakening as a political community came in the mid-19th century. The idea of United Slovenia emerged and inspired the first national program. The timing confirms that Slovenians were very much in touch with the time. Namely, this period in European history was named Spring of Nations in Europe. However, the progress toward building a nation-state was not straightforward. Slovenia spent the majority of the 20th century in political union with a group of South Slavic nations. First in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, then in the kingdom of Yugoslavia, and consequently, for almost half a century, in the socialist, communist Yugoslavia. Even though this, in quotation mark, brotherhood of South Slavic nations was not perfect, I have to say that it allowed some progress in terms of maturing of our nation towards full political autonomy. Unlike in previous multi-ethnic entities, Slovenians were one of the constituent nations of Yugoslavia. We enjoyed constitutionally guaranteed political and cultural autonomy within the federation, and Slovenian language was one of the official languages. Over time, though, Slovenians realized that Yugoslavia does not allow for the potential, did not allow for the potentials of our nation to be fully realized. When the winds of change started blowing across Europe at the end of the 80s, of last century. It became clear that staying in Yugoslavia would mean to be left, to put it simple, on the wrong side of history. Slovenians recognized this historic opportunity to join the wave of democratic change and to return, we used to say, back to Europe. At the end of 1990, a referendum of independence was held. Almost 90%, not those who attended the referendum, but 90% of the registered voters voted for independent and sovereign Slovenia. A great deal of effort and goodwill from Slovenia was put into a negotiated solution that would be in accordance with the Yugoslav constitution. And I must underline that constitution allowed for the self-determination of nations. However, it takes, as you know, to negotiate. Unfortunately, Slovenia found no intent or will to negotiate on the Yugoslav side. As the tragic events of the 1990s in the Balkans proved, Slobodan Milosevic had other plans. Our newly achieved sovereignty was challenged immediately and forcefully, militarily. The day after the declaration of independence, Yugoslav army attacked. A short yet serious armed conflict ensued in the fight for the youngest nation state in Europe of the time. As you see, we prevailed. Our sovereignty was challenged in economic terms as well. Overnight, Slovenia, heavily reliant on exports to the other parts of former federation, for instance, lost its main markets and of several decades. Our businesses managed to reorient towards primarily Western Europe, one would say in a remarkable short time, and started to grow our economy. At the time, Slovenia was often referred to as the star of the transition toward market economy. We were catching up the average European Union development at a fast rate and were making steady progress toward the European Union membership. I mentioned earlier briefly the seeming paradox of newly established nation-state rushing to join an integration of nations that is based on pooling sovereignty. But I also added that this did not feel like a paradox. Naturally, there were some questions about ceding sovereignty. However, there was very little doubt that integration indeed is the best way for a modern European nation to secure its sovereignty. The notion was again tested in a popular vote. The referenda on accession to the European Union and NATO confirmed resounding support for their membership, and Slovenia joined both integrations in 2004. The two memberships have a different meaning for our sovereignty. NATO, as an alliance of sovereign nations, acts as the ultimate guarantee of security and sovereignty. The European Union, on the other hand, is founded on a different idea of sovereignty. Member states are sovereign nations in their own right. However, each of us ceded a portion of our sovereignty to allow a unique system of governance in pursuit of common European objectives. Slovenia is one of the 28 member states with equal rights, but of course also responsibilities. The balance between the national and European competences and powers is both a result of historic developments as well as a topic of ongoing discussions. These discussions are not confined to textbooks. They were very alive during, for instance, a recent economic crisis in Europe. And Slovenia was one of the European member countries who took the biggest hit. The so-called Troika, International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank, European Commission, was knocking on our doors. Slovenians understood very well that the bailout would not only bring relief for our fiscal troubles. We understood that the price would be paid with limitations to our sovereignty, at least for a period of time, and at least in our fiscal policy, we would not be the masters of our own destiny. Result to avoid such scenario, we took some, I would say, painful decisions and managed to weather the storm. Today, our economy is growing again. However, as the European Union economy has gradually been regaining steam, it found itself face to face with the largest migration flow since the Second World War. Europe seemed to have been caught off guard. You would imagine I'm talking about this latest wave of refugees and migrants. The crisis has reached unimaginable, almost I would say, biblical proportions. In Slovenia alone, more than 470,000 migrants have crossed our eastern border on their way to Austria and Germany since last October. This huge human wave was very diverse. It consisted of not only refugees from Syria and Iraq, but also economic migrants from countries from Bangladesh, I would say, to Morocco and many in between. A lot of them were young males, but there were also whole families, most vulnerable groups of women and children. Let me remind you that Slovenia is a country of 2 million and of the size, as I said, New Jersey. To deal with this huge migration flow, it took really great efforts of our police, civil protection, even armed forces, health professionals, many humanitarian organizations and volunteers. We have provided shelter and humanitarian assistance to refugees and migrants on a daily basis. This was, I would say, humanitarian side of the story, but there is a security one as well. So at the same time, we have managed to secure safety of our residents, as well as the residents of other Schengen countries. Schengen countries system means that once you enter the area, you are free to travel without showing any documents whatsoever. There are no borders anymore. For us to be able to continue to do so, I must admit, deflating the number of migrants, refugees, using the so-called Balkan route was indispensable. There were moments that we were on the brink of collapse, I must say. So the lowering of the number of the people crossing the country, it allows us to exercise the prerogative to control our borders. In other words, to secure our sovereignty. Colleagues, to fully grasp the future challenges to our sovereignty, it is among others important to look at the origins of the crisis around us. As we see it right now, the main source of the migration pressures are troubles in the Middle East, North Africa, and still to some extent in Afghanistan. The war in Syria in particular is a strong driver of the migration wave. It also enabled the growth of the so-called Islamic State that we have talked so much for the last 3 days, and generally a dramatic heightening of the terrorist threat. Slovenia, I must say, has not had any direct terrorist threat today. However, to think that we are somehow not affected would mean that we do not understand the nature and the goals of modern-day terrorism and extremism. The existence of ISIL, Daesh, is a threat not only to fundamental values of the European Union, but also to the values which Europe shares with the United States. The fundamental civilization values, human rights, and freedoms are at stake. This means that our sovereignty is also at stake. Defeating ISIL Daesh does remain an absolute priority to the international community at this particular moment. Slovenia is strengthening its contribution in the global coalition to counter Daesh ISIL, in the military domain as well. Apart from donating some armaments, munitions, up to 15 members of Slovenian armed forces will help to train the defense forces of Iraqi Kurdistan Peshmergas. Allow me to put this into the perspective. Given the ratio between the size of my country and the United States, for instance, these 50 men and women would translate to some 2,500 American pair of boots. So I would like to finish with this. Well-coordinated, effective, and decisive action, which I believe it was confirmed in the last 3 days as well, is required to counter this dramatic rise of terrorism. And each of us must contribute according to one's capabilities, abilities. Thank you.